Welcome to State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well, broadcasting on KSQD Santa Cruz on 90.7 FM and live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, licensed marriage and family therapist. Today we're airing the very first episode that we ever recorded for the show, and it was previously only released as a podcast. The show's been completely reworked for broadcast today, and this will be the first time it airs on the radio. In this episode, I'm joined by guests Judy Brennis and Hannah Jones to discuss attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as adult ADHD. Hannah shares her personal story of her struggles leading up to and then being diagnosed as an adult with ADHD, her journey of learning to accept and understand herself, her seeking support, and then ultimately finding strategies and skills to accomplish her goals and dreams. Judy shares her experiences and wisdom from having a child diagnosed with ADHD, from leading support groups and working as an ADHD coach. We'll be discussing the kinds of challenges people with ADHD face, how adult ADHD differs from childhood, how to get properly diagnosed, and where to find help and support. So welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So, let's start with what are we talking about here, right? Some people call it ADD, some people call it ADHD. What is the difference and what is it that we're talking about?
ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder affecting both children and adults. It's described as persistent or an ongoing pattern of inattention and or a hyperactivity, impulsivity that gets in the way of daily life of typical development.
What's the difference between ADD and ADHD?
It's really very much the same thing. People that they classify as hyper ADHD, you usually think of as hyperactive in terms of needing to move all the time. But what they say is that even with the ADD, your brain is always hyper. You're thinking a million thoughts at one time. So some people do tend to classify them separately, but we really look at it as a coach as pretty much the same thing.
Okay, so even if their bodies aren't hyper, you're saying inside their minds are jumping around from subject to subject or having a hard time focusing.
Very much, and that's what impacts them the most. Mm-hmm. Especially the hyperactivityness does tend to, not with all, but many adults, it dissipates a little bit. So, or they use exercise. They exercise a lot. So yeah, the thing that impacts them in their life most is the constant thinking of different things and being attracted to many things at the same time.
Okay. So Hannah, I noticed that when I was introducing you, you mentioned about working with people with ADHD and executive function challenges. What is executive function challenges, and is that part of ADHD?
Absolutely. So you can think of it this way. Everybody who has ADHD has challenges with their executive functions. Not everybody who has challenges with executive functions has ADHD.
Oh, okay.
So, there are just about everybody in modern life has some kind of challenge around executive functions because there are things like planning, prioritizing, setting goals, staying organized, and there's also an emotional component to it, like emotional regulation, not getting flooded with feelings. So to one extent or another, we all have challenges with those things, but those of us who have ADHD sort of get an extra dose of challenges.
Okay,
yeah.
All right. So, like, for example, today we're going to really focus on adult ADD and ADHD, but a lot of people think of this as a disorder of childhood or a challenge of childhood, right? So what kinds of things might people see, for instance, with a child who has some of those executive functions and the attention deficit hyperactivity disorder?
Well, one of the things, and I think this is what people comes to mind most, is children in classrooms that have a difficulty sitting still, focusing on what the teacher is saying. Following directions is a huge one.
What is that have to do with the what executive functions do those kind of things have to do with?
With following directions, first of all, you have to be able to focus to listen to everything the teacher is saying. You have to be able to remember what they said to do first.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it's also true that, I think part of why I wasn't diagnosed till midlife, other than the fact that I'm just older and many, many fewer kids were being diagnosed back then, is that there are 3 subtypes of ADHD. One is the sort of hyperactive subtype that we all think about. There's also an inattentive subtype, and those students are likely to disappear. They're the daydreamers. They're the ones who are just slower getting their materials out. They might leave their homework at home, but they tend to be non-confrontational and quiet. So they disappear. And oftentimes, girls in particular internalize their symptoms, whereas it's more likely for boys to maybe act out and be the classic hyper kid.
Got it. So what kind of numbers are we talking about, in children? I think I've heard some interesting things on the news, so I'm curious. What percentage of children are being diagnosed with ADHD these days?
Well, they're saying about 9.5%.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that includes both of these different types that you're talking about?
Well, and there's a third type too, which is the combined subtype, which means that, and I'm combined subtype, some aspects of hyperactivity and some aspects of the sort of inattentive style.
And then what about in adults? You said it changes. Earlier you mentioned something about how some things will go away as they get older. So, I imagine there might be adults out there that are older that, certainly 9% were not being diagnosed 10, 20 years ago. So there might be adults out there wondering, what would this look like for an adult? What are some of the typical symptoms or...
Well, I think it happens frequently where adults have had no idea that they have ADD until their children are diagnosed. And then when they start learning about it, they're like, wow, this sounds just like me. And then oftentimes they then think about their parents. And they're like, wow, my mom, must have been ADD. Or I was just talking to a client who's 44 and her 68-year-old mother was just diagnosed with ADD. For the adult, now there are some adults that are still extremely hyper. The head of our coaching academy actually said he would teach classes on through the phone, but on the treadmill. But for the most part, it's like Hannah was saying, having difficulty planning, having time management is really difficult. So setting up 3 different appointments, boom, 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 right after the other, because they didn't think about, they have to travel from one to the other. Or if they're traveling, thinking about, well, how long is that, it's going to take. Like when I left today to come here, normally it could take 20 minutes. But I had to think about in the morning, it's going to take maybe an hour. So allowing for that kind of time. So as an adult, those things come up. Often it can impact work. It can impact relationships, is one that people don't think about. But it can have a huge impact on relationships because...
Can you think of some examples of things that you've seen?
Sure. It can often come off as a little bit as one person is being the person with ADD is being inconsiderate because of the time management. They say, they tell their spouse, I'll be home at 2:00, and they're home at 6:00. They didn't even think about it. They leave their phone in the car, and so their spouse can't get a hold of them.
There's another aspect too, which is sort of the emotional aspect. I think I mentioned that the one thing that adults with ADHD seem to have in common is some kind of emotional dysregulation. We feel things really powerfully, and those emotions can kind of flood us and shut down some of our executive functions.
Even further.
Yeah.
Oh,
so, like, for example, on the relationship front, people with ADHD seek novelty because that's what gets our dopamine firing. That's what gets us the sort of ability to focus that we crave so much because it's hard for us. And so early on in a relationship, oftentimes people with ADHD are the most romantic, attentive, hyper-focused people in the world. And then once the relationship becomes more routine, they still love their partner, but they have moved on to another fascination maybe. So it can be a really painful thing for people in relationships.
Okay.
And the other thing I was going to add was that for the non-ADD spouse, they sometimes fall into the parent role. And so that can be difficult, where they're checking on the spouse or feeling that they have to tell them what to do. So the dynamic becomes uncomfortable. So now there's been books written and tools and strategies to learn how the non-ADD spouse can best support the ADD spouse without becoming a
parental
parent.
figure. Okay, well, I think I'm getting a little ahead of myself in that. Hannah, you are here first, I think, to share with us just your experience, your journey of finding out that you had ADD as well into your adulthood, as I understand. So are you wanting to do that at this point?
Sure, I'd be happy to. It's funny because I was a teacher for 25 years and I read so many IEPs and went to so many meetings and had so many students with ADHD, and I always felt a real affinity for them and I was really good at helping them, but I never saw myself in them until I went down to half-time teaching so that I could finish a book I was writing. I was writing a novel, and it was the opportunity of a lifetime. I had been working full-time. I mean, I babysat when I was 12 years old, so to have this break and freedom to do a dream of mine was wonderful until it kind of became horrible because I could not manage my time. I would do something like think to myself, okay, I'm going to look up a good place name for my characters to go to on vacation. And 6 hours later, I'd still be on the internet and I'd be someplace completely different and look up at the clock and think, oh no, I wasted another day. So, and it also, having that sort of lack of structure was really triggering for me, and I felt a lot of shame about having failed at things in the past, having taken longer to do things than other people take. I was doing a master's program and it took me 10 years because I finished the coursework on time, but it was really hard to get myself to write that 50-page thesis. So there's been this whole pattern in my life of procrastination, not finishing things, losing track of time. And I just got so frustrated that I had to find the answers, and I went in for counseling and got diagnosed.
So it was your counselor that diagnosed you?
Well, it's interesting. She's a psychologist, and so she wasn't the one to diagnose me herself, but she said, I have an inkling that this is what's going on, and she sent me to behavioral health over at Sutter, and I had a full workup. And one of the things that's interesting about adult ADHD is you have to be able to trace it back to childhood. So if you're having ADHD symptoms for the first time as an adult, it's not ADHD, it's something else. It could be hormonal, it could be situational, but it was very clear to me when I looked back that I'd been struggling with these issues my whole life.
I see. And why was getting diagnosed important for you?
It was like putting on a pair of glasses and seeing the world from a whole new perspective. All of a sudden, things that had been bothering me that were fuzzy and out of focus and confusing made sense through this new lens. And it also opened up for me the possibility of working on myself and taking care of myself and supporting myself in the way that I had done for students for so many years. This is embarrassing, but I didn't keep a calendar until I got diagnosed with ADHD. I just held everything in my head. And my plan book for teaching was really loose. I would go in and sort of rest on the laurels of my creativity and my inventiveness and my love of adrenaline rushes, and make stuff up the day that I taught it sometimes. And when I realized that I had ADHD and there was something I could do about it, I started to find tools and strategies and medicine, which also helped a lot.
KSQD thanks Family Service Agency of the Central Coast for supporting this program. Family Service Agency provides counseling and support for people of all ages facing life crises and challenges. You can reach them at 423-9444 to see if they can help you. Thank you, Family Service Agency of the Central Coast, for supporting KSQD 90.7 FM.
This is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with guests Hannah Jones and Judy Brennis about adult attention deficit disorder, or also known as ADHD. Back to our interview. I'm just so curious about, was it difficult for you to find out that that was the description? I mean, you said that in a way it was helpful, but were there two sides to it?
Oh, for sure. And it kind of came in waves, too. Like, at first I was relieved because I had an explanation for what was going on. And then I got really curious. And then I just had huge waves of sorrow that I hadn't gotten help sooner, that I had gone through so much of my life with sort of one hand tied behind my back, and also real concern that maybe there was something wrong with me. You know, one of the things about ADHD is it happens all the way across the IQ spectrum. You can be brilliant and have ADHD, and you can be in remedial classes and have ADHD. It tends to impact a person's ability to perform at the level that they should be able to based on how smart they are. But so for me, there was this sort of anxiety about maybe I'm not smart, you know, maybe I'm broken in some way that makes me less than other people.
Yeah, that makes sense, because
Yeah.
you're attempting these things that you have a vision of, but you can't quite make them happen.
Right.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, that shame I was talking about, I have never spoken to an adult with ADHD who hasn't at some point had to face the shame of not having become everybody or everything that they think they could have become. We're all feeling like, I could have done more, I could have been more. You know, there's that saying that on your deathbed, you'll never think to yourself, oh, I wish I'd worked more, gone to more meetings, or made more money. But that's not what I find. I find that for adults with ADHD, they're thinking, I had real talents to give to the world, and I haven't been able to give my all yet.
Mm-hmm. But it sounds like for you, that's been turning around.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the exciting thing to me is that having strategies makes me so much more productive, so much braver. You know, I actually worked with Judy for a while when I first got diagnosed, and she was really helpful in...
You worked with her in what capacity?
She was my coach.
Oh, great.
Yeah. And she really helped me to learn how to manage my time and create realistic goals so that I could finish the book that I was writing. And I did finish it. Still looking for a publisher, so if anybody wants a kind of a weird young adult novel, you know, hit me up.
Okay. Good, you got to make your plug.
Yeah.
So Judy, when you listen to Hannah's story about getting diagnosed as an adult and that, you know, are there any parts of that that really stand out to you in the clients that, you know, that you've seen repeatedly with the clients that you've worked with?
All of it. I mean, her story is the same story as all the adults that I've worked with, all the adults I interviewed for the book. This finding out later in life that there was a name for what was going on. When she talks about not having realized all her dreams, or some people say, I feel like I didn't reach my potential. If they had been diagnosed sooner and learned tools and strategies and been just more aware that they could have done so much more or could have done something differently. So a lot of a lot of what I work with initially with clients, with adult clients, is often, like Hannah was saying, about the shame and the acceptance that they can't go back 20 years and change this. But so this is what I'm dealing with now, and this is how I can move forward.
And even if kids are diagnosed, some don't want to say they had that issue or don't want the tools. I mean, that's my understanding, at least. Is that what you find? Because they don't want to be that thing. They just want to be normal.
That's true, but that brings up what it's a lot of times what I find is the parents that don't want their child labeled, which actually I was just watching a movie, the Train to Paris, where the three guys thwarted the guy who, the terrorist, and it was really interesting because it goes back to their history, and it shows them growing up. And two of the three boys, their mothers were brought into the school, and the teacher tried to say, I really think your boys have possibly ADHD, and I would suggest getting them checked out. And she gave them some examples, and both mothers were just appalled. How dare you say that? And every boy looks out the window or runs around a lot, whatever. And it was so interesting to me because throughout the movie, it kept going back to things he forgot, and he joined the military and how it affected him. He almost got kicked out of the military. So I think it's so important for parents to realize that the label is really what you make of it. And if you learn early on, and if the parents present it in the way that, yes, you have ADHD, but that doesn't limit your potential at all. You can still do whatever you want, and you have we're going to help you get a team of people to support you. And medication can be controversy, but like Hannah said, so often it's helpful. And so children themselves, they may go through a time when they're teenagers, they don't want to admit that they have ADD, but a lot of times it's how it's presented and how it's dealt with in the home for how well they deal with that.
Okay.
Is it okay to jump in?
Yeah, please do.
I think it's really important to point out to anybody of any age who gets newly diagnosed, there are definite advantages that come with having ADHD. It's not all a limitation. So, for example, there's this theory that we are sort of hunter-gatherers in an agricultural world. We're extra able to sort of see differences and see interesting things off on the horizon that other people don't notice. We tend to think globally. We tend to be really funny and inventive and have out-of-the-box ideas for things. And I know for me, having struggled with things so much has given me a double dose of compassion that is really important to a lot of people, including neurotypical people.
Well, how does that show up in your life? Give an example of how, you feel that it's given you a kind of compassion that's maybe changed how you've responded to a situation.
I think I understand in a really profound way what it feels like to just be a weirdo. Late, staring off into space, confused, showing up for the team picture with the wrong color jersey on, all of those things. Anything that can happen to a person has happened to me. And so when I see it happening to my clients or to my friends or whatever, I can laugh about it, I have perspective on it, and I also know enough to go beyond the surface, oh, I'm so dumb, or I'm such a space cadet, and say, oh, hang on, let's back up and talk about this a little bit. Are you? And the other thing, I think, since I became a coach myself and developed all these tools and strategies, I'm also really willing to meet somebody where they are and challenge them a little bit and say, you know what, this could be better. And I think that's part of compassion too, not just sort of patting somebody on the back and saying, oh yeah, well, that's just the way you are.
So helping them make it better. Do you want to talk about that a little bit? Because both of you now have mentioned, or both of you are in the field of coaching people who struggle with ADD. So what is that about, and who might use that, and how would they use it? And both of you can respond to that question.
Well, anybody can use the, the benefits of coaching, and it's really working with somebody on their day-to-day stuff, and everything from the little things that getting their laundry done, washing their dishes, having a strategy for that or a routine for that. We talk about sleep. A lot of people don't even they look at, when you look at your day, you figure, okay, it starts in the morning, but it really starts the night before, because it depends how much, if you get a good amount, enough sleep. So we talk about all that, setting goals, doable goals, like Hannah said, being realistic. A lot of people tend to, like, if we talk about the importance of exercise, I'm going to get started. Okay, I ask, how many times do you think you're going to, you want to go to 5 days a week? I'm going to go to the gym 5 days a week. Well, let's start with 2. Let's just make it doable so that they have success. Because the more the more unrealistic their goals, it just, I can't, I'm a failure. It just supports what they think they are, rather than making it successful, doable steps that they can accomplish. And it's amazing, once they see that they can make changes and move forward, it makes it so much easier to make progress in all other areas. And then we talk about the kind of the underlying things that Hannah was talking about in terms of self-esteem, confidence. Negative thoughts is a huge one, like Hannah was saying. Not calling yourself a loser, I'm stupid, and all of that. And looking at your strengths. I was just reading something Dr. Hallowell said, who is kind of the guru of ADD and wrote the first book on ADD, Driven to Distraction. And he talks about focusing on your strengths, and that's one thing that people get caught up, I think, in feeling that they should work on their weaknesses and they should build them up and make them better. Or parents will focus, oh, my kid's not doing very well in math, I better get him a tutor, and I better do this. And for people with ADD, really anybody, but most important, people with ADD, to focus on your strength areas. And as far as your weaker ones, you can learn tools and strategies, but sometimes it's best, if you can afford it, hire somebody to clean the house. That's not, women with ADD, often that's so boring, it's just torture. Have someone else do that, and then you can devote yourself to the creative pursuits that you are so good at. So really recognizing those strengths is important.
Mm-hmm. So helping them decide where to really put their energy in terms of making the change they want to make.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, underlying coaching is the belief that our clients are creative, resourceful, and whole, and that they have the answers themselves. So it's really important to know that coaching isn't somebody coming in and fixing your life. It's you having a designed conversation with someone who's really good at asking the right questions to draw out of you what you want. And also who's got some strategies and some tools. I mean, I think the difference between ADHD coaching and regular life coaching is there might be a little bit more scaffolding in ADHD coaching. So it might be part of the role of the coach to help be the part of the prefrontal cortex of the client that's struggling a little bit and build that out for them.
Prefrontal cortex, what do you mean by that?
That's the sort of the seat of the executive functions, and it's actually more complicated than that, but that's the part of the brain that is responsible for thinking about the future, long-term planning, organizing, prioritizing, all of the executive functions.
So you'll stand in and be their prefrontal cortex for a little while?
Or show them other ways to do it. But yeah, and I mean, I think part of what happens, Judy was talking about partners who end up parenting their partners and it not being a good thing. Mm-hmm. There's a fine line between enabling and supporting. And a coach is trained to be able to say, okay, where is it happening that you just keep hitting a wall? Let's build in some support for that. And it might be something like a house cleaner, or it might be teaching them about an app, or teaching them about reminders, or whatever the case may be. We don't teach executive functioning strategies to young people very often, and we did it even less back in the day. I think people do a lot better job of it now in schools, but so teaching compensatory strategies can really help a lot.
I think, and coaching is the goal of coaching is, like Hannah said, you can kind of step in and be their prefrontal cortex while you're teaching them or helping them learn how to do it themselves, so that eventually they don't need a coach for their whole life. They may need, like I call them tune-ups, where they come back, and kind of, they may slip back into old patterns and need to be refreshed. But the idea, and the same like with parents and children, you're teaching them how to be independent with the idea that eventually you can step back and they can do it themselves. There's always a time where you need your parents, but for the most part you can be independent.
You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD K-Squid, many voices, one station. And this is State of Mind, being human and living well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. And now you can tune in to KSQD anytime through your home smart speaker by just saying, play K-Squid on TuneIn. You can now also listen or download all State of Mind shows on Apple Podcasts and Google Music Play. And if you subscribe, you'll get new shows automatically delivered to your listening device. In case you're just joining us, I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with guests Hannah Jones and Judy Brennis, and we're talking about what it's like to live with adult attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, also known as ADHD, how it differs in adulthood from childhood, how to get properly diagnosed, and where to find help and support. Back to our interview. If you don't mind, I want to go back to something that came up earlier. You mentioned about taking medicine, and Judy, you also mentioned that can be controversial. So I'm wondering if we could talk a little bit about what your personal experience, Hannah, is with taking medicine and what you found in the clients that you work with.
Yeah, well, my experience is kind of atypical in the sense that I'm still on the first medicine I ever tried. A lot of times people have to try different formulations and different dosages to find the right one, and some people do well on stimulants, some do well on non-stimulant ADHD drugs. I'm on a stimulant. It's called Concerta, and it's sort of a time-release Ritalin, which is sort of the classic. Mm-hmm. Ritalin and Adderall are the two best-known stimulant drugs. For me, it was really interesting because when I first took it, I suddenly found that my train of thought became stickier. Like I could persist in a task longer without finding myself, going off the rails. It kind of slows me down, which is really interesting because we think of stimulants as speeding us up. So I found it really useful. I also did something that I think a lot of people with ADHD do, and I've seen it in my clients. I got some traction in my life. I felt good about stuff, and I thought, haha, I don't need it anymore. And I stopped using it entirely.
And then what happened?
All hell broke loose. I was not as effective anymore. I mean, it turns out that absolutely while you're on medicine, you can work on leveraging the pills to develop strategies. And the strategies stay whether you're on drugs or not. But that sort of little dopamine thing that I get from my medicine that helps me to be more focused and more persistent, that goes away when the drug goes out of my system. Which in a way is kind of reassuring, right? It's not like I'm taking some mind-altering substance that turned me into another person. And I think that's what I hear a lot from people. They're afraid that they're not themselves when they're on the drug, or they feel like it's cheating. My daughter, who's 28, when I told her that I was going on ADHD medication, she was really terrified because she had seen all these kids at college get addicted. They were selling it to each other so that they could write papers or party or whatever. And she had a lot of really negative ideas about it. And she was worried about me changing in some way, number one, and number two, and becoming an addict. And I just had to say to her, you know what? This is really helpful. I'm well in control of it. I'm under a doctor's care. And it's not a mind-altering drug. It's not changing the way I think. I'm not hallucinating. It's just really a matter of giving me the same neurotransmitters that other people have so that I can do the things that other people can do themselves. It's more like insulin than LSD or something.
Yeah. So Judy, Hannah's talking about how her daughter responded negatively when she first told her about taking medication. It's my understanding that's not uncommon that people will get feedback like that from teachers or, you know, parental friends that might be looking after them. And I'm just curious what your experience with that is.
Well, what I since I don't have ADD personally, from what my clients have told me, and especially when I wrote the book and interviewed like 26 people, and they all but one young man had stopped taking his medication, but all the others had said it was life-changing. And that's what the thing that I hear most is that it changed my life. For the first time I was able to think one thought at a time. Some of my clients that have resisted it for a long time, when I don't push it on them, but I suggest that they research. And when they decide to try, the other thing that's so good about that's one of the advantages of ADD medication, you can't try it. You can it's some medications you have to slowly build up a dose. You have to be on it for 6 weeks before you see any result. Then you have to taper off if it's not you don't like the side effects, whatever. But ADD medication, you take it and within a very short amount of time, 30 minutes or something, you begin to feel the effect of it. And when you stop taking it, if you decide it isn't right for you, you don't have to wean off of it. So it's easier, you're saying, to give it a try. And right. I did recently have one guy who was really the first time that someone has brought up afraid of what could happen while they're on it. But like Hannah said, it's not like taking LSD. They're not going to trip out. They're not going to hallucinate. I've never heard of that. It just can really be so beneficial for children. I know parents have a hard time with it. And when my daughter was diagnosed, there wasn't much information, but I remember thinking, well, I don't want her medicated. I did find a school for her that was very outdoorsy, 5 kids in a class, so she didn't really need the medication. But for children that are in most schools, it gives them that chance to be able to sit there and focus and to sit still, to be able to do their homework. What people say is basically it levels the playing field. And it just, from what I've seen, there's more advantages than disadvantages to it.
But I'm wondering also about whether people often get negative feedback from others in their world about taking medication.
I haven't experienced that or heard that too much, but the one thing I really always suggest is to become informed. If you're taking medication, know how it's helping. Hannah mentioned the prefrontal cortex. It has to do with the neurotransmitters. If you know why you're taking this medication and what it's doing for you, you're much more confident that you're doing the right thing. And if somebody says something, you can explain it to them. So I think that's important. The other thing I was going to mention was that I did have a client who talked about, and I think that parents sometimes, and adults, make the mistake of thinking the medication is going to fix ADD. They're going to be fine, like waving a magic wand. And that's not exactly the case. This one client I was referring to, she was a writer and her office was in her behind her house. If she took the medication while she was still in her house, she would get focused on cleaning the kitchen or, something like that. She had to wait till she got to her office to take the medication. It's not going to help you make the decision on what to focus on. So they say it's a team approach with ADD. It's the people that are most successful take medication, have a therapist or a coach, have a supportive family, friends, and around them that help them succeed.
Mm-hmm. And they say you can't say pills not skills, it's got to be pills and skills. They go together.
That makes sense, yeah. So Hannah, would you say that there's still big challenges that you face in your life?
Absolutely.
Which ones are they, and which ones are inside and which ones are outside of you?
That's a great question. I've chosen to be really open about my own ADHD. It happened almost immediately. I was in the newspaper last year as a coach who has ADHD, and here I am talking on the radio. I really want people to know that it's not shameful, and it's not it doesn't make you broken, it doesn't make you less than, it just makes you different. So that said, I do notice sometimes people in my life now have a word for my behavior when I act in ways that are disorganized, flighty, and I'll hear a little like ADHD under their breath, and it kind of hurts my feelings sometimes because I like to be able to own my own behavior and take responsibility for it without being labeled. And I think that's really important in working with anybody who has ADHD. It doesn't define us and it doesn't control us necessarily. It's a difference. But just as you wouldn't comment on other personal attributes of people in a judgmental way, you shouldn't be commenting about that either. So it's a fine line to make yourself vulnerable, especially as a professional. I'm saying come be coached by me, and also I have ADHD. I might make some mistakes. I'm going to have vulnerabilities that match yours. That's a kind of a scary thing to admit sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's courageous of you.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, really. You're tuned to listener-supported 90.7 FM KSQD, K-Squid, Community Radio for the Monterey Bay. And this is State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. We're also live streaming over the web at ksqd.org. And now you can tune in and catch any and all of your favorite programs on K-Squid through your home smart speaker by just saying, play KSQD on TuneIn. If you're just tuning in, I'm your host, Deborah Sloss, and I'm here talking with two guests, Hannah Jones and Judy Brennis, and we're talking about what it's like to live with Adult Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, also known as ADHD, how to get properly diagnosed, and where to find help and support. Back to our interview. I'm wondering if there are specific resources that both of you would want to share with our community. People might be thinking, what if my child has ADHD? How would I get them diagnosed? Who would I go to? Or how do I learn more about this? So,
well, locally, I run 2 ADHD support groups. And on the second Wednesday of every month from 6:30 to 8 at the fire station near Cabrillo for parents of children, teens, young adults with ADD. And then on the 4th Wednesday of every month, 6:30 to 8 at the same location, is for adults with ADD. But the 2 biggest organizations are CHADD, and you can
you spell that out?
CHADD
What does
with
that
periods in
stand
between.
for?
Children and adults with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder.
Okay, so CHADD, CHADD. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's the largest nonprofit resource organization. They do a lot of research. They implement a lot of programs. They have webinars. They have a wonderful website with lots of information. And then there's ADDA, ADDA.
ADDA, okay.
Adults with Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder. And they were a group of people that branched off from CHAD about 28 years ago, because CHAD does emphasize children with ADD, and so ADDA is for adults with ADD. They also have a wonderful website and these webinars that you can every Wednesday at a certain time plug into. There's the National Resource Center on ADHD, which is a program of CHAD, but it's a national clearinghouse of information and resources. And then there's so many websites. You know, if you Google, there are ADD, there's Moms with ADD, ADHD Marriage, Living with ADD. I mean, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, yeah. What about locally? Are there specific resources locally that you'd want to talk about? Like, does CHAD have a local chapter?
Well, that's the support group. My
so
support group is a CHAD support group.
Oh, I see. So
Yeah.
you're part of that organization.
Yeah.
Oh, okay,
Yeah.
great. As we're getting toward the end of our show, I'm thinking about people that might be listening, and if there was somebody listening to your story, Hannah, and wondering, God, I wonder if I have ADHD, or I wonder if my son or daughter or my partner might, what would you want them to know?
If you have it, congratulations. It can be really great. You're probably feeling frustrated in some ways, but there is relief for that frustration. There are workarounds. And if you've lived for it this long, you've developed some amazing coping strategies that you can leverage to really help yourself get the life you want. So that's one thing. And the other thing is it can be a little bit daunting to take the first step to find help. There are lots of ways in. You can go to your general practitioner and just say, hey, I think I might have this, and get a referral.
A referral to where? Let's talk about that. How do people find out?
Sure. Well, if you go to your GP, they'll probably put you in touch with behavioral health through whatever insurance company you have. Or there are lots of local people who do ADHD diagnosis. So there's basically... They can actually see through brain imaging difference in brains of people who have ADHD, but that's not how they diagnose people. There's about a 2-hour-long intensive sort of questionnaire that you go through that's looking for patterns. Has this been happening your whole life? Has it affected different areas of your life in a sort of a persistent negative way? So that's the way people start off looking at whether they have ADHD. There are also online tests. You can take really simple screening tests that ask like maybe 20 questions or something, and you can use that as a pre-screen to see if this is something that might really be going on for you.
Judy, I kind of want to ask you a similar question, because I know as we were getting ready for the show and we were talking a little bit, this topic came up. You know, how would people find out, and what's important for them to know? You know, in my own experience as a therapist, sometimes people go very circuitous routes and wish that they had a more direct way of learning about what's going on for them. So what would you want our public to know about that?
Well, I always encourage people to get a thorough diagnosis. And one of the important things about assessments is oftentimes there's what is called comorbidities, which the person with ADD, I think I was just reading, 40 to 50% chance of a comorbidity, which means a lot of times anxiety goes hand in hand with ADD, depression. So while a person may go to their family doctor, especially for children, the pediatrician, and he may say, yeah, it seems like he has ADD. But you really want to get a thorough diagnosis. He may very well have ADD, but he may have anxiety as well, or depression, or OCD, and some of these things show up in ways that aren't typical. My own daughter when she was in junior high, kept telling me she felt she was depressed. But she was the most outgoing, involved in choir and all these different things. And my idea back then, way before I was a coach, was the person who's depressed that sleeps a lot, but she was diagnosed with depression. So you really want to have a thorough diagnosis from somebody who specializes in that.
Okay, so typically who does those kind of things? You mentioned, is it a psychologist?
Yes, usually a psychologist.
And what is it called? What are they looking for? It's my understanding they're called neuropsych evaluations oftentimes, right, is the most thorough.
Yeah.
If there's questions about what other kinds of things might be going on.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And Judy's right. It's really important. ADHD often does not travel alone. And I don't want to paint too sunny a picture of it, there is a really high correlation between having ADHD and things like substance abuse, getting into more car accidents, risk-taking behavior, all the way through the lifespan. But especially, with kids and adolescents, it can be very dangerous. But addictions are much more common in people who have ADHD. So it is really important to get a thorough, neuropsych evaluation. You can get through the door in a number of ways. You can see your GP first. You can see your regular therapist first. You can talk to a teacher if it's a student. But you do want to go all the way to a full evaluation.
Good. I'm glad you let people know about that because I often get questions about that.
Yeah.
Judy, I asked that question to Hannah about if somebody's listening and wondering if they have ADHD or loved one might have ADHD, and what would you want them to know? And I thought maybe you'd want to answer that question too.
In terms,
just pearl of wisdom from your experience of working with people. What do you think is important for them to know?
Well, I think Hannah had mentioned that it's not a death sentence. I had a woman, I walked into my meeting quite a few years ago, and she was sitting there crying, and she said her child was just diagnosed with ADHD, and there are a lot of, like Hannah said, a lot of strengths that go along with it, and once you're aware of that and you find the proper support for your child or yourself, to learn how to focus on those strengths, to really work on I said earlier, the negative talk, and that it doesn't mean that you're broken or you're flawed or there's something wrong with you. I love working with people with ADD because they're the most authentic, real people. Within 3 minutes, they're talking to me like we've known each other for 10 years. You don't have to go get through that wall of reserve. Or I've noticed with the teens, there is no attitude. They don't know how to be. We used to say this about our daughter. She was our oldest, and I never really understood when people talked about teenage attitudes. She didn't know how to be anything but herself. She was just herself, and so they're very warm-hearted.
Sounds like you're saying, very authentic people.
And so to help that, one of the things I love to do as a coach is to help my clients recognize that in themselves.
I'm wondering if there are specific sort of myths or misunderstandings about ADHD that you would want people to know. Be a myth buster.
Well, the number one is that it's not real. And I think even though today there is so much talk about ADHD, there are still some people that don't believe that it's real. And again, when I started it as a coach, and you hear the same kind of stories and the same language, the broken, the flawed, and on the report cards didn't reach their potential, and they've struggled their whole life with or disorganization and all of that. And you see how much it has impacted them. It is definitely real. Everybody can at times be forgetful, disorganized, and all of that, but it doesn't impact their life. And that, my daughter's first therapist years ago said something to me that has really stuck with me. And because I was asking, well, should she go? She started seeing a therapist at age 5. Is she going to go for the rest of her life? And he said, when the environment is right and she's doing well, that's fine. But then, and I have noticed it's a lot of times environments play a big part, which someone with ADD, once they learn they have it, can be aware of. Like Hannah said, as a teacher, she was going gangbusters. Then she had to create her own schedule as staying at home, and it became much more difficult. So it's definitely real. The number 2 that comes to mind is people think it's the little boys that can't sit still and all of that. And again, like Hannah said, girls are often the ones misdiagnosed, not diagnosed, because they're quieter, they're the dreamers.
Another one that occurs to me is, I just had a client yesterday say, well, I don't think I could have ADHD because sometimes I really, really focus on things and the whole world goes away. That's actually a trait of ADHD called hyperfocus. So when we're really in the zone, we can disappear into a project, and it's a fantastic feeling. But it also is a little bit of an out of control feeling sometimes because it's hard to pull out of it. So yeah, that's a myth that if you can pay attention to something, that must mean that you don't have it.
That was the one thing that I remember I kept talking about to my daughters, to the preschool teacher and everything. Well, how can she have ADD? She could sit forever in front of, in the computer, play a little game, but it was that hyper focus that I didn't realize back then.
I want to say thank you again to my guests today, Hannah Jones and Judy Brennis, and thanks to you for joining us here on State of Mind, Being Human and Living Well. I'm your host, Deborah Sloss. To hear more conversations about mental health and wellness here on the Central Coast, join me on the first Sunday of every month from 6 to 7 p.m. right here at K-Squid, 90.7 FM. You can now get all State of Mind shows as podcasts on Apple Podcasts and Google Play Music. And if you subscribe, new shows will be automatically delivered to your listening device upon release. In all our State of Mind shows, we seek to educate by featuring personal stories of mental health recovery and wellness, and the sharing of resources. So if you have a topic idea or you have a story to share, email me at debra.stateofmind@ksqd.org. I want to say a special thanks to my amazing co-producer Lauren Fine for lending her technical expertise and her general wizardry to help bring this show to you. Also thanks to acoustic guitarist Adrian Legg for composing, performing, and donating the use of our theme music. This is listener-supported community radio, so that means we want to hear from you. Let us know what you think about this or any of the shows you're hearing here on KSQD. Just send us an email at onair, that's ONAIR, @ksqd.org, or call 831-900-5773. And if you like what you're hearing, you can also help us keep it going by going to the donate button on our website, ksqd.org. Donations of any size really do help. Become a supporting member, or if you have a business, consider underwriting this or any of our programs. Just go to the Support Navigation tab at ksqd.org. You can also find all the podcast episodes of this show on our website by typing State of Mind in the search bar. This is KSQD Santa Cruz. Just remember, 90.7 FM, K-Squid, your ink spot on the dial. Stay with us.